come closer. I have a story for you tonight, one that kept me up past midnight when I first discovered it. It's about a woman who spent 11 years believing she was saved by the man who destroyed her family, and the devastating moment she learned that salvation and destruction had worn the same face all along. But here's what makes this story unlike anything I've ever told. The man who burned down her world would also burn down all of England to keep her safe. And when the monster who was supposed to own her returns to claim what he believes is rightfully his, he'll discover exactly how far obsessive love will go. This is the Duke's revenge, and I'm so glad you're here. Tell me, where in the world am I reaching you tonight? Whether you're in bed, on a train, cooking dinner, or hiding from responsibilities, drop your location and your local time below. I love knowing who's listening. Tonight's tale takes us to the candlelit corridors of 1863 England, where the scars we carry on, our skin often tell simpler stories than the scars we carry within. Our heroine has worn her burns like a badge of survival for 11 years, never knowing that the guardian who nursed her back to health, who watches her with eyes that burn hotter than any flame, who has quietly destroyed every man who dared look at her too long, was the very man who set the fire that consumed her childhood. But when a monster from her past returns to claim her, every secret will be exposed, every lie will unravel, and everyone will learn what happens when you threaten something that belongs to the most dangerous duke in England. Our tale begins on a winter evening in 1863, at a ball where obsession wore the mask of propriety, and a dead man's sins were about to walk back into the light. The Duchess of Pemberton's winter ball was the event of the season, and Genevieve Hartwell had never felt more like a fraud. She stood near the refreshment table, her gloved fingers wrapped around a glass of champagne she had no intention of drinking, watching the glittering assembly with the detached observation of someone who had never quite learned how to belong. At 25 years old, she was well past the age when society expected women to marry. But that wasn't what set her apart from the laughing debutantes and preening matrons who filled the ballroom. It was the scars. They traced up her left arm in twisted ropes of silvery tissue, visible even through the delicate lace of her sleeve. They curved around her shoulder, climbed the side of her neck, and kissed the edge of her jawline, a permanent reminder of the fire that had stolen her family when she was 14 years old. The scars had their own texture, their own landscape. In some places, the skin was smooth and unnaturally taut, stretched thin over the muscle beneath. In others, it bunched and ridged like the surface of a disturbed lake frozen in place. The color varied too, pale pink in some lights, silvery white in others, occasionally flushing red when the weather changed, or her emotions ran high. She had learned every contour of that damaged terrain over 11 years, had traced it with her own fingers in the privacy of her chambers, had come to know it as intimately as any cartographer knows a map. She had learned over the years to hold herself with dignity, despite the whispers that followed her everywhere. Poor thing. Such a tragedy. She might have been beautiful, if not for... But tonight, the whispers seemed louder than usual. Or perhaps she was simply more aware of them, because tonight, for the first time in 11 years, she felt watched in a way that had nothing to do with her scars. The ballroom itself was a marvel of excess. 3 enormous chandeliers dripping with crystal, their 1,000 candles casting dancing shadows across walls papered in gilt and crimson. The scent of hothouse flowers, roses, lilies, gardenias imported at ruinous expense, mingled with the cologne and perfume of 300 guests. A string quartet played something elegant and forgettable from a dais in the corner, barely audible over the buzz of conversation, the rustle of silk gowns, the clink of champagne glasses. Genevieve catalogued these details with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 11 years as an outsider looking in. She noted which matrons wore last season's fashions and which had commissioned new gowns. She observed which young men lingered too long near the punch bowl, gathering courage to ask certain young ladies to dance. She watched the intricate dance of social hierarchy play out in nods and cut directs, in the angle of a chin or the precision of a curtsy. She saw all of it, understood all of it, and felt separate from all of it. "You're not drinking your champagne." The voice came from directly behind her, low, rich, and intimately familiar. Genevieve didn't turn around, but she felt her pulse quicken despite herself. "I'm not thirsty," she said. Lucian Ashworth, Duke of Aldridge, moved to stand beside her, his presence commanding even in stillness. At 38, he remained one of the most striking men in England, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair silvered elegantly at the temples and eyes the color of smoke that seemed to see straight through every pretense. Those eyes had haunted Genevieve's dreams for years, though she had never admitted it, even to herself. He moved with the controlled grace of a man who knew exactly how much power he possessed and chose, most of the time, not to use it. His evening clothes were impeccably cut, emphasizing the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his frame. A ruby stick pin gleamed in his cravat, a family heirloom she knew, passed down through generations of Ashworth Dukes. Everything about him spoke of wealth, breeding, authority. And yet there was something in the way he stood slightly too close to her, in the subtle tension that ran through his frame. Whenever another man approached, that hinted at depths most observers never saw. He was also her guardian, her protector, the man who had pulled her from the flames 11 years ago and given her a home when she had nothing left. And lately, he was something else entirely. Something that made her heart race and her thoughts scatter whenever he stood too close. "You've been standing here for 20 minutes, he observed, his gaze fixed on the dancers rather than on her. His voice was low, meant only for her ears, intimate despite the crowd surrounding them. "Lady Pemberton will be offended if you don't dance at least once. Then Lady Pemberton will have to survive her disappointment." Genevieve kept her tone light, though her pulse quickened at his nearness. She could smell his cologne, sandalwood, and something darker, richer, that she had never been able to identify, but had come to associate with safety and home. "I'm sure she has more pressing concerns than whether her guests are meeting their dancing quotas." A ghost of a smile crossed his features, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Stubborn as always. You raised me. A fact I'm reminded of daily." Now he did look at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. His eyes traveled over her face, with an intensity that felt almost physical, lingering on the scars at her jaw as if he were memorizing them. "You look beautiful tonight, Genevieve." She felt heat rise to her cheeks. He had never said such a thing to her before. Not like this, with that rough edge to his voice that suggested the words had been dragged from somewhere deep. "You don't have to say that." "I never say things I don't mean." Before she could respond, a figure materialized at her elbow, a young man with golden hair and an eager smile that immediately set her teeth on edge. Lord Marcus Pemberton, the Duchess's youngest son, recently returned from the continent and apparently determined to make up for lost time by pursuing every eligible woman in London. "Miss Hartwell," he executed an elaborate bow that Genevieve found more theatrical than charming. "I've been hoping to secure a dance with you all evening. Might I have the honor?" Genevieve opened her mouth to decline. She always declined. But before she could speak, Lucian's hand closed around her elbow, with a pressure that was just this side of painful. "Miss Hartwell has already promised this dance to me," he said, his voice pleasant in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps later in the evening?" Lord Pemberton's smile faltered slightly at the Duke's tone. "Of course, Your Grace. Another time, then." He retreated, and Genevieve turned to Lucian with raised eyebrows. "I wasn't aware I had promised you anything." "You hadn't. But I wasn't going to stand here and watch that boy drool over you like a dog eyeing a bone." The possessiveness in his voice should have irritated her. Instead, it sent a shiver down her spine that she firmly refused to examine. He was being polite. He was being predatory. There's a difference. Lucian's jaw tightened. "I've seen the way he looks at you, Genevieve. The way half the men in this room look at you. As if your scars make you somehow available, desperate, easy prey. And you appointed yourself my protector? I've been your protector for 11 years. I see no reason to stop now." Something in his voice made her look at him more closely. There was tension in the line of his shoulders, a tightness around his eyes that she had learned to recognize as barely controlled emotion. Lucian Ashworth was famous for his icy composure, his ability to remain unmoved in the face of any provocation. But right now, watching Lord Pemberton's retreating back, he looked anything but unmoved. He looked furious, and beneath the fury, something else, something that looked almost like fear. "Lucian," she pitched her voice low enough that only he could hear. "What's wrong? You've been on edge all evening." For a long moment, he didn't answer. His gaze swept across the ballroom with the systematic attention of a general surveying a battlefield, and Genevieve had the sudden, unsettling sense that he was looking for something. Or someone. "Nothing's wrong," he said finally. "I simply don't like crowds." It was a lie. She had known him long enough to recognize when he was lying, the almost imperceptible tension in his voice, the way his eyes didn't quite meet hers. But before she could press him, a commotion at the entrance drew both their attention. The crowd was parting, whispers spreading like ripples on water, and through the gap emerged a figure that made Genevieve's blood turn to ice. He was old, at least 65, perhaps older, with a face like a skull draped in parchment, and eyes that gleamed with a hunger she recognized on some primal, instinctive level. His evening clothes were immaculate, his bearing aristocratic, but there was something wrong about him, something that made her skin crawl even before she understood why. "Who is that?" she breathed. Beside her, Lucian had gone absolutely still. Not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of a predator preparing to strike. "Lord Edmund Grimsworth," he said, and his voice was barely human. He was supposed to be dead. Now, it's important to understand what it meant for a man like Grimsworth to appear in society in 1863. He had been exiled 15 years earlier, disgraced by rumors too persistent to ignore, whispers of 2 dead wives, of servants who fled his household in terror, of practices so depraved that even the most hardened aristocrats turned away in disgust. He had retreated to the continent, where his money bought silence and his title bought access, and England had collectively agreed to forget he existed. But here he was, walking through Lady Pemberton's ballroom as if he owned it, his dead eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Genevieve with an impact she felt like a physical blow. He smiled, and Genevieve, who had survived a fire that should have killed her, who had endured 11 years of whispers and pity and the special cruelty reserved for damaged women, felt genuine terror for the first time since she was 14 years old. "We're leaving," Lucian said, and his hand closed around her arm with a grip that would leave bruises. "Now." "Lucian, what?" But he was already moving, pulling her through the crowd with a ruthlessness that drew startled looks and offended murmurs. Genevieve stumbled to keep up, her mind racing with questions she couldn't ask, her heart pounding with a fear she didn't understand. They were almost at the door when Grimsworth's voice cut through the noise of the ballroom, carrying with the practiced projection of a man accustomed to commanding attention. "Aldridge, surely you're not leaving so soon. I had hoped to renew our acquaintance and to meet your lovely ward." Lucian stopped. Genevieve felt the tremor that ran through him, felt the way every muscle in his body coiled with the effort of restraint. "Turn around," she whispered. "Don't give him the satisfaction of seeing you run." For a moment, she thought he wouldn't listen. Then, slowly, he turned to face Grimsworth with an expression of such cold contempt that several nearby guests took an involuntary step backward. "Lord Grimsworth," his voice was ice and iron, "I had heard you were dead. What a disappointment to discover the reports were exaggerated." Grimsworth's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too white, too perfect, like a mask of civility over something rotting. The Duke of Aldridge, still as charming as ever. And this must be. His gaze crawled over Genevieve with an intimacy that made her skin try to peel itself from her bones. "Miss Genevieve Hartwell, how you've grown." "We haven't met," Genevieve said, and was proud that her voice didn't shake. "No, we haven't, but I knew your father quite well." Something flickered in those dead eyes, amusement perhaps, or anticipation. "We had a business arrangement, he and I, one that was unfortunately interrupted." "Genevieve, go to the carriage," Lucian said, not taking his eyes off Grimsworth. "I'm not leaving you. Go. To the carriage." Each word was a command, spoken with an authority that brooked no argument. Now. She went. Not because she was obedient. She'd never been obedient. But because she recognized something in Lucian's voice that she had never heard before. Not anger. Not fear. Desperation. The ride back to Aldridge House was silent. Lucian sat across from her in the carriage, his face a mask of stone, his hands clenched into fists on his thighs. Genevieve watched him in the flickering lamplight and felt the questions building in her throat until she thought she might choke on them. But before she could speak, the carriage jolted to a sudden stop. Voices outside. Men's voices, rough and demanding. And then the carriage door was wrenched open, and Lord Pemberton, the same golden-haired young man who had asked her to dance, thrust his head inside with an expression of false concern. "Miss Hartwell, thank God. When I saw Aldridge drag you from the ballroom, I feared the worst." His eyes flickered to Lucian with barely concealed contempt. "Everyone knows about his possessiveness. I wanted to ensure you were leaving of your own free will." Genevieve felt Lucian go rigid beside her. The temperature in the carriage seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Lord Pemberton," Lucian's voice was silk over steel, "remove yourself from my carriage before I remove you permanently. I'm not speaking to you. I'm speaking to Miss Hartwell." Pemberton reached for Genevieve's hand with an audacity that stole her breath. "My lady, if this man is holding you against your will, if he has threatened you in any way, you need only say the word. My carriage is just behind. I can take you somewhere safe." Safe. Lucian laughed, and it was the most dangerous sound Genevieve had ever heard. "You think you can keep her safe? You, who have been following her for 3 weeks like a dog in heat. You, who have been telling anyone who will listen that the Duke of Aldridge keeps his ward like a prisoner, that she must be desperate for rescue?" Pemberton's face flushed. "I never? You sent her flowers last Tuesday. Roses, with a card that read, 'For the caged bird who deserves to fly free.' You bribed her lady's maid for information about her daily schedule. You positioned yourself outside the milliner's shop on Bond Street 3 separate times, hoping for an accidental encounter." Lucian leaned forward, and his eyes were burning coals in the darkness. "I know everything you've done, Pemberton. I know every word you've spoken about her, every fantasy you've entertained, every pathetic scheme you've concocted. And I am telling you now, with absolute certainty, if you ever come near her again, I will destroy you so completely that your own mother won't recognize what's left. Pemberton's face had gone from flushed to deathly pale. You're mad. No, I'm protective. There's a difference. Lucian's hand shot out, grabbing Pemberton by the cravat and yanking him half into the carriage. She is not a bird in a cage. She is not a damsel in need of rescue. She is the most important person in my world, and you insignificant, presumptuous little boy, are nothing but an irritation I have tolerated for too long. This is the only warning you will receive. Do you understand? Yes. Good. Lucian released him with a shove that sent Pemberton stumbling backward into the street. Drive on, he called to the coachman, and the carriage lurched forward, leaving Pemberton standing in the rain-slicked cobblestones. Genevieve sat in stunned silence for a long moment. Then, carefully, she said, "You've been watching him." "I watch everyone who shows interest in you. That's extremely unsettling." "Yes." Lucian didn't look at her. "It is. How long have you been doing this?" "Since you were 20 years old, and the Earl of Westbrook tried to court you. I had him investigated within a week. Discovered he had a gambling problem and 3 mistresses. Arranged for certain debts to be called in. He left London within the month." Genevieve's mind raced backward through the years, cataloging every suitor who had inexplicably lost interest, every potential match that had dissolved before it could begin. Lord Ashby, the one who proposed and then suddenly withdrew. He had a taste for violence against women. I ensured his previous victims felt comfortable coming forward. Sir Richard Morley? Syphilis. I merely made sure you were informed before the engagement could proceed. And Lord Pemberton? Arrogant and entitled, but relatively harmless. I was content to let you reject him on your own merits. Muscle twitched in Lucian's jaw. Until tonight, when he touched you. He touched my elbow. He touched you. The words were savage. No one touches you. No one looks at you the way he was looking at you. No one speaks your name with that proprietary tone, as if he had any right, any claim. You're jealous. The realization struck her with the force of revelation. You've been jealous this whole time, of every man who showed interest in me. Lucian finally looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes made her heart stutter. Jealous is not a strong enough word. Jealousy implies something fleeting, something rational. What I feel when another man looks at you is something far older and far darker. It's a possessiveness that borders on madness, a need to claim you that I have spent 11 years trying to control. His voice dropped to a whisper. I have no right to feel this way. You are my ward. I am supposed to protect you, to guide you toward a suitable match, to celebrate when you find happiness with another man. Instead, I have systematically sabotaged every relationship you might have formed, because the thought of you belonging to someone else makes me want to burn the world to ashes. The confession hung between them, impossible and electrifying. Tell me, she said finally. Whatever it is, whatever you're hiding, tell me. Not here. Then where? Lucian, that man looked at me like he owned me. He mentioned my father. He said they had a business arrangement. What did he mean? Lucian's jaw worked. A muscle twitched in his cheek. And then, in a voice she had never heard from him before, a voice stripped of all control, all composure, all the careful distance he had maintained for 11 years, he said, "Your father sold you to him." The words didn't make sense. They were sounds without meaning, syllables that her brain refused to process into coherent thought. What? When you were 12 years old, your father signed a contract promising you to Grimsworth in marriage. in exchange for £20,000 to cover his gambling debts. Lucian's voice was flat, mechanical, as if he were reciting facts from a ledger rather than destroying everything she thought she knew about her past. The marriage was to take place on your 18th birthday. Grimsworth had already buried 2 wives by then, both of whom died under suspicious circumstances. He had a reputation for particular tastes that involved young girls in pain. Genevieve's stomach heaved. She pressed her hand against her mouth, fighting back nausea, fighting back the scream building in her chest. No, my father wouldn't. Your father was weak and desperate, and he chose his own comfort over your safety. Something in Lucian's voice cracked. I tried to stop it. I offered to buy out the contract. I went to the magistrates, to solicitors, to Parliament itself. But the law protected men like Grimsworth and your father. A father's authority over his daughter was absolute. There was no legal way to break that contract. So what? Genevieve heard herself ask from very far away. What did you do? The silence that followed was the longest of her life. And then Lucian said, in a whisper that sounded like a confession and a curse and a prayer all at once, I set the fire. The world stopped. I paid a man to ensure that your family's house burned that night, Lucian continued, each word a stone dropped into the abyss opening between them. Your father had promised to deliver you to Grimsworth within the month. There was no more time for legal maneuvering, no more options to explore. So I chose the only option left. I chose murder. Genevieve couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except stare at this man who had been her guardian, her protector, the center of her universe for 11 years, and see a stranger wearing his face. You weren't supposed to be there. His voice broke on the words. You were supposed to be at your aunt's house. I confirmed it 3 times. But your father changed his mind at the last moment, called you home, and I didn't know until I arrived and saw you in the upstairs window with the flames already climbing toward you. You killed them. Her voice didn't sound like her own. You killed my parents, my brother. I pulled you from the flames myself. Tears were streaming down his face now. Lucian, who never cried, who never showed emotion, who had been carved from ice and iron for as long as she had known him. I broke through a wall to reach you. I carried you out while the building collapsed around us. And then I sat at your bedside for 3 weeks, begging God to let you live, knowing that if you died, it would be my fault. You raised me. The horror was seeping into her voice now, into her bones, into every cell of her body. You took me in. You pretended to save me while knowing that you were the reason I needed saving. I owed you a debt I could never repay. Your family, your childhood, your chance at a normal life, I stole all of it. The least I could do was give you a new life, a safe life, a life where Grimsworth would never touch you. But he's here now. Genevieve was shaking, violent tremors that racked her entire body. He's back, and he looked at me like he believes the contract is still valid. Lucian's voice hardened, the tears drying as something colder took their place. He's been waiting all these years for you to come of age, waiting for the right moment to return and claim what he thinks is his. But he will never touch you, Genevieve. Do you understand me? He will never lay a single finger on you. I will burn down all of England before I let that happen. Like you burned down my home? Like you burned my family? The words hit him like physical blows. She saw him flinch, saw the pain ripple across his features, and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication, just a vast, echoing emptiness where her trust in him had been. I deserve that, he said quietly. I deserve whatever hatred you have for me. But right now, none of that matters. What matters is keeping you safe from Grimsworth. After that," his voice caught. "After that, you can hate me forever. You can have me arrested, tried, hanged. I won't fight it. I'll confess to everything. But first, I have to keep you alive." The carriage rolled to a stop in front of Aldridge House, but neither of them moved. Genevieve stared at the man across from her. Murderer, protector, guardian, liar, and tried to find some solid ground in a world that had just crumbled beneath her feet. "Why?" she whispered. "Why did you care what happened to a stranger's daughter? Why risk everything to save a girl you'd never even met?" Lucian closed his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was raw, with a grief that predated her. "Because I had a sister once, and I failed to save her from the same fate." The Dwysam story emerged in fragments, each one more terrible than the last. Eliza Ashworth had been 16 years old when their uncle sold her to Grimsworth in exchange for £15,000. Lucian had been 19, newly come into his title after their parents' death in a carriage accident, legally powerless to intervene in his sister's marriage, despite being the head of the family. "I went to every solicitor in London," Lucian said, his voice hollow, emptied of everything except ancient grief. "I begged them to find a way to break the contract, but Eliza was not yet of age, and our uncle was her legal guardian until she married. The law was clear. A guardian could do whatever he wished with his ward, including selling her to the highest bidder." He paused, his hands trembling in his lap. Genevieve wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but she was frozen in place by the horror of what she was hearing. "I tried to buy out the contract myself. I offered Grimsworth twice what our uncle had received. £30,000, a fortune by any measure. He laughed at me, said money wasn't what he wanted, said he had specific tastes, and Eliza fit them perfectly." Lucian's jaw tightened. "I should have killed him then. I had the opportunity. But I was young and naive, and still believed that the law would protect the innocent if you only found the right magistrate, the right barrister, the right lord who could be persuaded to intervene. What happened to Eliza? She married Grimsworth on her 17th birthday. I was not invited to the wedding. Grimsworth saw to that. I was not allowed to visit her in the first months of her marriage. By the time I finally gained access to their household, I barely recognized her." The words that followed were clinical, detached, as if Lucian could only speak them by removing himself from their meaning. The bruises hidden beneath long sleeves. The burns, small, deliberate, hidden in places no one would see. The way Eliza flinched, at sudden movements, jumped at raised voices, apologized constantly for offenses she had not committed. The hollow look in her eyes that spoke of a spirit being systematically crushed. He was destroying her in pieces, Lucian said, a little more each day, breaking her down until there was nothing left but an obedient shell that existed only to serve his twisted pleasures. And I could do nothing. I could do absolutely nothing to stop it. "You tried." I went to the magistrates. They told me that a husband had the right to discipline his wife as he saw fit. I went to the church. They told me that marriage was sacred and that Eliza must submit to her husband's authority. I went to Parliament. They laughed at me, literally laughed, and asked why a duke would concern himself with such trivial domestic matters. His voice cracked on the last word. In the dim light of the carriage, Genevieve could see tears streaming down his face, tears he didn't bother to wipe away, tears that seemed to have been waiting 15 years for permission to fall. Eliza lasted 8 months. At the end, she didn't recognize me anymore. The physician said her mind had simply retreated, that the horrors she had endured had made reality unbearable, so she had found somewhere else to go. Grimsworth claimed she died of a fever. But I saw the body before they buried her. I saw the marks on her wrists, the bruises around her throat. I know what really killed my sister. I swore on her grave that I would never let it happen again, Lucian continued. And then, 3 years later, I learned about the contract between your father and Grimsworth. I heard rumors at first, whispers about a merchant's daughter promised to a lord with dark tastes. I investigated, hoping the rumors were false. Instead, I found evidence that your father had sold you for £20,000, that the marriage was to take place on your 18th birthday, and that Grimsworth had been telling his associates how much he was looking forward to breaking in his new wife. Genevieve felt sick. The champagne she hadn't drunk threatened to rise in her throat. I saw the same fate approaching for another innocent girl, and I knew I would do whatever it took to stop it. Even murder, even damnation, even losing you, which is the only thing I've ever been truly afraid of. He opened his eyes, and Genevieve saw something in them that stole her breath. I have loved you since you were 20 years old, Genevieve. I have watched you grow into the most remarkable woman I've ever known, and I have hated myself for loving you because I knew that I had no right, that everything I am, everything I have, was built on the ashes of your family. The confession hung between them, impossible and devastating. You love me, she repeated, as if testing the words. More than my own life, more than my honor, more than my soul. His voice was barely a whisper. But I don't expect anything from you. I don't expect forgiveness or understanding or anything except the hatred I deserve. I just need you to know, before whatever happens next, that everything I did, every lie, every sin, every unforgivable choice, I did it because I couldn't bear to see you suffered the way Eliza suffered. I did it because even before I loved you, I would have moved heaven and earth to keep you safe. Genevieve sat in the darkness of the carriage, tears streaming down her face, and felt the foundations of her entire existence crack and shift beneath her. She should hate him. She wanted to hate him. But somewhere beneath the horror and the betrayal and the grief, something else was stirring. A terrible, complicated understanding of what desperation could drive a person to do. I need time, she said finally. I can't process this right now. I can't even look at you right now. I know. He reached for the carriage door, then paused. There's something else you should know. Something I've kept from you because I was afraid of what it would mean. What else could there possibly be? Lucian's hand trembled on the door handle. When I first brought you to Aldridge House, I told myself I was simply fulfilling an obligation, that I would find you a suitable guardian, a respectable situation, and remove myself from your life once you were settled. But I couldn't do it, Genevieve. Every time I tried to arrange for your care elsewhere, something stopped me. I couldn't bear the thought of you in some stranger's house, surrounded by people who didn't understand what you had survived, who might not protect you the way you deserved to be protected. So you kept me. I kept you, and I told myself it was duty, responsibility, the obligation of a guardian. But it wasn't. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were burning with something that made her heart stutter. I kept you because even then, even when you were a traumatized child, and I was a guilt-ridden wreck of a man, I felt something for you that I couldn't name. I kept you because the thought of you leaving made me feel like I was dying. I kept you because you were already mine, Genevieve, in every way that mattered, and I couldn't let you go. He stepped out of the carriage before she could respond, leaving her alone with revelations that would take far longer than one night to process. The next 2 weeks were the longest of Genevieve's life. She confined herself to her rooms, refusing to see Lucian, refusing to see anyone except the maid who brought her meals that she barely touched. She needed to think. needed to examine every memory from the past 11 years through the lens of this devastating new truth. On the 5th day, she couldn't bear the silence of her chambers any longer. She waited until the servants had retired for the night, then slipped through the darkened corridors of Aldridge House, walking the familiar paths that had been her home for more than a decade. Her feet carried her without conscious direction, past the library where Lucian had taught her Latin, past the music room where she had learned to play the pianoforte, past the portrait gallery where generations of Ashworth ancestors watched with painted eyes. And then she found herself standing before a door she had never noticed before. It was tucked into an alcove at the end of the east wing, half hidden behind a heavy tapestry, depicting a hunting scene. The door itself was unremarkable, plain wood, no ornate carvings or gilded handles, but something about it drew her forward. A strange certainty that whatever lay beyond would change everything. The door was locked, but Genevieve had learned long ago which keys Lucian kept in his study and where he hid the ones he thought no one knew about. It took her 15 minutes to find the right one, a small brass key hidden in a false bottom of his desk drawer. Her hands trembled as she fitted it into the lock. The room beyond was not large, perhaps 15 feet square, with no windows and only a single candelabra for illumination. But every inch of wall space was covered. Drawings, paintings, sketches in charcoal and ink and watercolor, and every single one of them was of her. Genevieve at 16, reading in the garden, her scarred arm visible against the white of her dress. Genevieve at 18, laughing at something someone had said just outside the frame. Genevieve at 20, standing at a window with rain streaking the glass, her expression distant and melancholy. Genevieve at 22, asleep in a chair by the fire, her face soft and unguarded in a way she never allowed when awake. Dozens of images, hundreds. Some were clearly done from life, capturing moments she remembered living. Others were from angles she couldn't have noticed, watching her from across a crowded room, observing her from a doorway she hadn't known was open. A few were imagined scenes. Genevieve in a wedding dress, Genevieve holding a child, Genevieve old and gray, but still beautiful, still loved, still watched. In the center of the room stood a small table, and on that table was a glass case containing a single object, a charred ribbon, the same pale blue as the dress she had been wearing the night of the fire. He had kept it. For 11 years, he had kept a piece of her destroyed childhood, preserved like a holy relic. I started drawing you 6 months after I brought you here. Genevieve spun around. Lucian stood in the doorway, his face half in shadow, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. I couldn't stop, he continued, his voice hollow. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw your face. Every time I entered a room, I looked for you first. I told myself it was guilt, that I was simply watching over you because I owed you a debt. But guilt doesn't make a man memorize the exact shade of someone's eyes. Guilt doesn't make him spend hours trying to capture the way candlelight plays across scarred skin. Guilt doesn't make him wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, terrified that something has happened to the one person he cannot bear to lose. This is... Genevieve couldn't find the words. The scope of his obsession was overwhelming, not just the drawings themselves, but the years of patience and dedication they represented. This is madness. Yes, he didn't try to deny it. It has always been madness what I feel for you, from the very beginning, perhaps even before. When I first learned about the contract between your father and Grimsworth, I told myself I was motivated by justice, by the memory of Eliza, by a desire to protect an innocent girl from a monster. But I think even then there was something more, something that recognized you before we ever met, something that knew you were meant to be mine. I was 14 years old. And I didn't love you then, not the way I love you now. I loved you the way one loves a sacred duty, a holy responsibility. But as you grew, he swallowed hard. As you grew, it changed, deepened, became something I couldn't control, couldn't deny, couldn't escape no matter how hard I tried. I have spent years telling myself that you deserve better than a murderer's devotion. That I should find you a proper husband, a good man, someone who could love you without the weight of blood between you. But every time I tried, every time another man looked at you with interest, I felt something in me turn savage, feral, ready to destroy anything that threatened to take you from me. Genevieve looked at the drawing surrounding her, at the ribbon in its glass case, at the man who had killed for her, lied for her, devoted 11 years of his life to protecting and watching and wanting her from a distance he thought he could never cross. "You should have told me," she whispered. "I know. All of this, the fire, Grimsworth, your feelings. You should have told me years ago. And what would you have done? Forgiven me? Loved me anyway?" His laugh was bitter. "I am a murderer, Genevieve. I killed your family. The fact that I did it to save you doesn't change what I am. It doesn't make me worthy of you. That's not your decision to make." The words came out sharper than she intended. "My forgiveness, my love, those are mine to give or withhold. You don't get to decide that you're unworthy and remove yourself from consideration. You don't get to play the noble martyr while hiding in the shadows, drawing pictures of me and sabotaging my relationships and pretending it's all for my own good." He flinched as if she had struck him. "Genevieve, I'm not finished." She stepped toward him, and something in her expression made him take a step back. "You have manipulated my entire life. You murdered my family, took me in, raised me, shaped me into the woman I am today, all while hiding the truth, all while nursing feelings you never intended to act on. You decided what I should know and when I should know it. You decided which men were worthy of my attention and which should be driven away. You decided, without ever asking me, that I was too fragile, too damaged, too precious to be trusted with the truth about my own existence. I was trying to protect you. You were trying to control me. There's a difference." She was close enough now to see the rapid pulse beating in his throat, to smell the sandalwood and smoke that had always been uniquely his scent. "And the worst part, the part that makes me angriest, is that I understand why you did it. I understand the desperation that drives a person to make impossible choices. I understand loving someone so much that you would burn down the world to keep them safe. I understand all of it, Lucian, because I feel the same way about you." The confession seemed to strike him physically. He swayed, his hand reaching out to brace against the doorframe. "You can't mean that." "I can. I do." Genevieve lifted her chin, letting him see the steel beneath the scars. "I have loved you since I was 20 years old. You impossible, infuriating, murderous man. I have spent 5 years watching you watch me, wanting you to close the distance between us, hating myself for loving someone who treated me like a child and a possession and a sacred object all at once. I have turned down every suitor who came calling, not because you sabotaged them, though I'm furious about that, make no mistake, but because none of them were you. None of them looked at me the way you look at me. None of them made me feel the way you make me feel. How do I make you feel?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Like I'm the center of the universe. Like nothing else matters except keeping me safe and happy. Like you would tear apart anyone who threatened me with your bare hands and not lose a moment's sleep over it." She reached up, touching his face with trembling fingers. like I'm loved, completely, obsessively, without reservation or condition or limit. Lucian caught her hand, pressing his lips to her palm with a reverence that made her heart ache. You are. God help me, Genevieve. You are all of those things and more. You are the only thing I have ever loved that didn't turn to ashes in my hands. You are the reason I wake up in the morning and the reason I can't sleep at night. You are my obsession, my torment, my salvation, and my damnation all wrapped into one. And I know I don't deserve you. I know that what I feel for you is too dark, too possessive, too consuming to be called love by any normal definition. But it's all I have to give. This twisted, desperate, all-encompassing devotion. It's yours. It has always been yours. Then stop hiding it. She stepped closer until barely an inch separated them. She could smell him now. Sandalwood and smoke and something underneath that was simply Lucian, a scent she had been unconsciously cataloging for years, associating with safety and home and forbidden longing. Stop pretending to be my guardian when what you want is to be my husband. Stop protecting me from the truth when I'm strong enough to bear it. Stop treating me like a precious object to be admired from a distance and start treating me like a woman who can match your darkness with her own. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them crackled with tension, with years of suppressed longing, with the devastating intimacy of truths finally spoken aloud. Genevieve could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, could feel the heat radiating from Lucian's body, could see the exact moment when something in his expression shifted from control to surrender. And then Lucian's control, the famous ironclad control that had governed his every action for 11 years, finally shattered. He kissed her with a hunger that stole her breath, his hands tangling in her hair, his body pressing her back against the wall of drawings that documented his obsession. The kiss was not gentle. It was not tentative. It was claiming, pure and simple, a declaration of ownership that matched everything she had seen in this room. His lips moved against hers with desperate precision, as if he had imagined this moment 1,000 times and was determined to make the reality surpass every fantasy. His hands slid from her hair to cup her face, his thumbs tracing the scars at her jawline, with a tenderness that made her chest ache even as his mouth demanded everything she had to give. Genevieve kissed him back with equal ferocity, pouring years of frustration and longing into the press of her lips, the scrape of her teeth, the desperate grip of her fingers in his coat. She could taste the champagne he had drunk earlier, the hint of tobacco from the cigar he had smoked in the garden, the salt of tears neither of them would acknowledge. She could feel the tremor in his hands as they mapped the contours of her face, could hear the ragged catch of his breath when she bit gently at his lower lip. When they finally broke apart, both gasping for air, Lucian rested his forehead against hers and laughed, a broken, incredulous sound that was half sob, half prayer. "I have dreamed of this," he said, his voice rough and wrecked. "Every night for 5 years, standing in this very room, surrounded by evidence of my obsession, and kissing you until neither of us could think. But none of my dreams came close to the reality. Then your imagination needs work. Apparently so." He pulled back to look at her, and his eyes were blazing with something that was almost too intense to meet. Love and desire and desperate hope, and the shadow of guilt that would probably never fully fade. "But we cannot. Not yet. Not with Grimsworth still out there. Not with so many things unresolved between us." "I know." She allowed herself one more moment of closeness, one more breath of his scent, one more press of her palm against his chest where his heart was racing. "But when this is over, when Grimsworth is destroyed, and the truth is no longer a wall between us. I expect you to make good on every promise implied by this room, Lucian Ashworth. Every drawing, every fantasy, everything. I will spend a lifetime making good on those promises, he said. I swear it on my soul. What's left of it? But promises made in the heat of revelation are not always promises that survive the cold light of morning. Genevieve woke the next day with the taste of him still on her lips and the weight of everything she had learned pressing down on her chest like a physical burden. She lay in her bed, staring at the canopy above, and tried to sort through the tangle of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. She loved him. That truth was undeniable, carved into her bones after years of suppressed longing. But he had murdered her family, her parents, her brother, the people who had shaped her childhood, who had given her life, who had sold her to a monster. That was the part she couldn't reconcile. Her father, who had bounced her on his knee and called her his little jewel, had signed a contract selling her body and her future to a man known for killing his wives. Her mother, who had taught her to embroider and play the pianoforte, had stood by and let it happen. Her brother, just 2 years older, had never said a word. Had they known what Grimsworth was? Had they cared? Or had she simply been property to them too? A daughter to be traded for the settlement of debts, no more valuable than a horse or a piece of furniture. By midday, Genevieve had made her decision. I need to leave, she told Lucian, finding him in his study where he had clearly been pacing for hours. Not forever. Just for a while. I need to think, and I can't do that here. Not with you looking at me like that. Like what? His voice was raw, as if he had been screaming into a pillow. Like you're waiting for me to destroy you. Like you're already bracing for the blow. She crossed her arms, hugging herself against the chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I don't want to hurt you, Lucian. But I don't know what I want anymore. I don't know what's real and what's been shaped by your manipulation. He flinched as if she had struck him. Everything you feel is real. I would never try to control your emotions. You controlled everything else. You decided what I knew and when I knew it. You decided which men were allowed to court me. You decided the entire shape of my life for 11 years. Her voice cracked. How can I trust that anything I feel wasn't engineered by you? How can I know that my love for you is genuine and not just a response to being isolated and dependent and watched? Genevieve, I'm going to stay with Lady Pemberton. She's offered before, and I've always declined because I couldn't imagine being anywhere but here. But I need distance, Lucian. I need to figure out who I am without you watching my every move. The devastation on his face nearly broke her resolve. He looked like a man watching his own execution approach, resigned, despairing, and utterly without hope. How long? He whispered. I don't know. A few weeks. Maybe longer. She forced herself to meet his eyes, to witness the damage she was inflicting. I'm not saying goodbye forever. I'm just saying, I need time. Can you give me that? I can give you anything. His voice was hollow. I would give you anything, even if what you're asking for is the one thing that might kill me. She left that afternoon. The first week was the hardest, for both of them. Genevieve threw herself into the whirlwind of Lady Pemberton's social calendar, attending teas and luncheons and evening entertainments with a desperation that fooled no one. The Duchess, kind woman that she was, asked no questions, simply provided distraction and companionship and an endless supply of biscuits. But at night, alone in a guest bedroom that smelled of lavender instead of sandalwood, Genevieve stared at the ceiling and ached. She missed him. God, how she missed him. The sound of his voice reading aloud from the morning papers, the way he always knew when she needed a cup of tea before she asked for it. The warmth of his presence at the breakfast table, solid and reassuring, a constant in a world that had proven itself capable of any cruelty. She dreamed of him every night, dreams of the shrine room, of his hands in her hair, of his mouth on hers demanding everything she had to give. She woke gasping, reaching for a body that wasn't there, and hated herself for her weakness. Meanwhile, at Aldridge House, Lucian was destroying himself by inches. The reports reached Genevieve through Lady Pemberton, who had her own network of informants among the servants of London's great houses. The Duke had not left his study in 3 days. The Duke had refused all meals. The Duke had been heard pacing at all hours of the night, his footsteps echoing through empty corridors like the footsteps of a ghost. His valet is genuinely worried, Lady Pemberton reported over breakfast in the second week. Apparently, he hasn't changed his clothes since you left, hasn't shaved. The man looks like a vagrant, according to my sources. He's being dramatic. Is he? The Duchess's eyes were shrewd. Or is he a man who has spent 15 years keeping you safe, only to watch you walk away? My dear, I am not suggesting you should rush back to him before you're ready, but I think you should understand what your absence is doing to him. Genevieve understood. That was the problem. On the 10th day, she received a letter, not from Lucian. She had made him promise not to contact her, but from his housekeeper, Mrs. Blackwood, who had watched over Genevieve since she was 14 years old. Miss Hartwell, the letter read, I know, you've asked for time, and I respect that, but I cannot in good conscience keep silent while my master wastes away. He's not eating. He's barely sleeping. I found him in that room yesterday, the one with all the drawings, just sitting on the floor and staring at the wall. When I asked if he needed anything, he said, I need her to come home, but I don't deserve that, so I need nothing. I've served the Ashworth family for 40 years. I saw His Grace through the death of his parents, through the tragedy with Lady Eliza, through every dark moment of his life. I have never seen him like this. He's giving up, miss. Not on life, on the will to keep fighting for it. I'm not asking you to forgive him. I'm just asking you to know the truth about what your absence means. Whatever you decide, decide it with full knowledge. Your faithful servant, Mrs. Blackwood. Genevieve read the letter 3 times. Then she crumpled it in her fist, pressed it against her heart, and wept. She went home the next day. She found him exactly where Mrs. Blackwood had described, sitting on the floor of the shrine room, surrounded by drawings of her face, looking like a man who had already died and was simply waiting for his body to catch up. He had lost weight. She could see it in the sharp lines of his cheekbones, the hollows beneath his eyes, the way his shirt, unchanged and wrinkled, hung loose on his frame. His hair was unkempt, his jaw shadowed with stubble, his eyes red-rimmed and swollen. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment he simply stared at her as if she were an apparition, a ghost conjured by desperation and longing. You came back, he said. His voice was a ruin. I came back. She lowered herself to the floor beside him, her skirts pooling around her like a fallen cloud. I told you it wasn't goodbye forever. I didn't believe you. His laugh was brittle, broken. I was certain you would realize how much better your life would be without me, without the man who murdered your family, who lied to you for 11 years, who loved you in ways he had no right to love. You're an idiot. She took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. My life without you isn't better, Lucian. It's empty. It's hollow. It's waking up every morning and reaching for someone who isn't there, and going to sleep every night knowing that the only person who has ever truly seen me, all of me, scars and darkness and everything, is somewhere else. Suffering because I needed time to think. Did you find the answers you were looking for? Some of them. She brushed her thumbs across his cheekbones, feeling the wetness of tears he wasn't bothering to hide. I realized that my father sold me to a monster, and I have no idea if my family would have protected me from that fate or delivered me to it with a smile. I realized that you did something terrible to save me from something worse, and that I will probably never fully understand how to feel about that. And I realized, her voice caught. I realized that none of it matters as much as the fact that I love you, that I've loved you for years, that being away from you felt like having part of my soul cut away, and I don't want to feel that way ever again. Genevieve, I'm not saying everything is resolved. I'm not saying I've forgiven you completely, but I'm saying that I choose you, Lucian Ashworth, with all your darkness and all your sins. I choose to build a life with you, however imperfect, however complicated. I choose to love you despite the reasons I have not to. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. I choose us. He shattered completely then, the last remnants of his composure dissolving into great, racking sobs that shook his entire body. He pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe, his face buried in her hair, his tears soaking into her dress, his voice repeating her name like a prayer, like a promise, like the only word that had ever mattered. I thought I had lost you, he gasped. I was so sure. You haven't lost me. You won't lose me. She held him just as tightly, this broken, complicated man who had killed for her and lied to her and loved her with an intensity that bordered on madness. I'm yours, Lucian. I've been yours since you pulled me from those flames. And I will be yours until we die. And after that, if there's anything after. I promise. They stayed on the floor of the shrine room for hours, holding each other, grieving for what had been lost and celebrating what had been found. When they finally emerged, both tear-stained and wrung out, something had shifted between them. The last barriers had fallen. The last walls had crumbled. They were no longer guardian and ward, no longer secrets and lies. They were simply two people who had chosen each other, in full knowledge of each other's darkness. And that choice, made freely and completely, was worth more than any fairy tale. 3 days later, Grimsworth's letter arrived. It bore no return address, but the handwriting was elegant and old-fashioned, and the seal, a serpent eating its own tail, made her blood run cold, even before she broke it. My dear Miss Hartwell, the letter began. Your father made me a promise, and I have waited long enough to see it fulfilled. The contract is still valid. The law is on my side. One way or another, you will be mine. The Duke of Aldridge stole you from me once with fire and murder. Yes, I know what he did. I have always known. But he cannot protect you forever. Accept your fate gracefully, and perhaps I will be merciful. Resist, and you will learn that the deaths of my previous wives were not accidents, but lessons in obedience that I greatly enjoyed teaching. I look forward to our wedding night. Until then, dream of me. Yours in anticipation, Grimsworth. Genevieve read the letter 3 times. Then she walked downstairs, found Lucian in his study, and placed the letter on his desk without a word. She watched his face as he read it, watched the color drain from his cheeks, watched his hands begin to shake, watched something dark and terrible rise in his eyes that frightened her and thrilled her in equal measure. He threatens you, Lucian said, his voice barely human. He threatens you in my house. He's not wrong about the contract. I had our solicitor look into it. Under English law, the agreement between my father and Grimsworth is still technically valid. If he takes the matter to court, he will never take any matter to any court. Lucian stood, and suddenly the room felt too small to contain him, too fragile to withstand the fury radiating from every line of his body. He will never speak your name again. He will never breathe the same air as you, never exist in the same country as you. Never. Lucian. She caught his arm as he moved toward the door, and the contact sent, electricity arcing between them. What are you going to do? What I should have done 15 years ago. His eyes met hers, and she saw death in them. I'm going to destroy him. If you kill him, I'm not going to kill him. Death is too gentle for Edmund Grimsworth. His smile was a knife blade in the candlelight. I'm going to take everything he has, his money, his title, his reputation, his freedom. I'm going to ensure that he spends the rest of his miserable life in a prison cell, surrounded by men who know exactly what he did to those women. And then, when he's lost everything, when he's broken and alone, and begging for mercy, then I'll decide whether to let him live. Genevieve should have been horrified. A civilized woman would have been horrified. Instead, she felt a savage satisfaction spreading through her chest, warming the parts of her that had been cold since she first saw Grimsworth's face at Lady Pemberton's ball. "How can I help?" she asked. Lucian's expression shifted. Surprise, then something warmer, then a fierce pride that made her heart race. "You want to help destroy the man who was going to destroy you? I want to watch him burn, the way my family burned, the way I burned." She lifted her chin, letting him see the steel beneath her scars. "The way your sister burned." For a moment, Lucian just stared at her. Then, slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand and cupped her scarred cheek with a tenderness that made her eyes sting. "I don't deserve you," he said softly. "I have never deserved you. But God help me, Genevieve. I am going to spend the rest of my life trying." The campaign against Grimsworth began the next morning. I have to pause here and tell you, this is where the story transformed from tragedy into something else entirely. Something darker. Something more satisfying. Because when Lucian Ashworth decided to destroy a man, he did not do it by halves. In the world of Regency England, power came in many forms. There was the power of title, which Lucian possessed in abundance. There was the power of wealth, which he had accumulated through shrewd investments and careful management of his estates. But most dangerous of all was the power of information. And Lucian had spent 15 years building a network of informants, investigators, and allies who owed him favors they could never fully repay. He had always known that Grimsworth might return. He had always known that the monster who had killed his sister would one day come crawling out of whatever continental hole he had been hiding in, looking to claim what he believed was his due. And so Lucian had prepared. He had gathered evidence. He had cultivated witnesses. He had created a web of documentation so thorough, so devastating, that when the time came, Grimsworth would find himself caught with no possibility of escape. First came the financial assault. Lucian had spent 15 years quietly acquiring information about Grimsworth's business dealings, waiting for the day when he might need to use it. He called in that debt now, unleashing a barrage of investigations and audits that revealed decades of fraud, embezzlement, and corruption. Within a week, Grimsworth's accounts were frozen. Within 2, his creditors were circling like sharks, scenting blood in the water. Then came the social destruction. Lucian visited every powerful family in London, every politician, every judge, armed with evidence of Grimsworth's crimes that he had gathered over years of patient investigation. The servants who had witnessed his treatment of his wives. The physicians who had documented injuries that couldn't possibly be accidental. The investigators who had traced the deaths back to poison and violence rather than illness and accident. One by one, The doors of society closed against Grimsworth, until he couldn't walk down a street without being cut by people who had once called him friend. But the true vindication came at the Marchioness of Blackwell's Spring Ball, the most prestigious event of the season, attended by everyone who mattered in London society. Genevieve had not wanted to attend. The whispers that had followed her for 11 years had only intensified since Grimsworth's return, and now they carried a new edge. Speculation about her relationship with her guardian, rumors about the contract her father had signed, gossip about whether she had always known she was promised to a monster. "You don't have to do this," Lucian said, as their carriage approached the Blackwell mansion, its windows blazing with light. "Yes, I do." Genevieve straightened her spine, feeling the familiar weight of her scars beneath the silk of her gown, a deep crimson tonight, chosen deliberately, the color of fire, the color of survival. "They've been talking about me my entire life. It's time they heard me talk back." The ballroom fell silent as they entered. Every head turned. Every conversation stopped. Hundreds of eyes tracked their progress across the marble floor, and Genevieve felt the weight of judgment pressing against her from all sides. She had spent 11 years enduring these stares, these whispers, the particular cruelty of a society that had decided she was damaged goods. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, she walked beside a man who looked at her like she was the only person in the room, the only person in the world, and his pride in her was a physical force that surrounded her like armor. Now, it's important to understand what this moment meant in 1863. A woman's reputation was her currency, her power, her entire existence in the eyes of society. To be whispered about was to be diminished. To be openly stared at was to be marked as different, other, less than. Genevieve had lived with that marking for 11 years, and she had never once fought back, never once demanded the respect she deserved, never once made society look at her scars and see strength instead of damage. Tonight, that changed. They had barely made it halfway across the room when a voice cut through the silence, high, feminine, deliberately carrying. "I still cannot believe Aldridge brought her here. After everything that's come out about her family, the gambling, the debts, the contract with that horrible man." Lady Margot Ashby, whose son had once courted Genevieve before his debts were called in, was holding court near the refreshment table, her voice pitched to reach as many ears as possible. One must wonder what kind of woman allows herself to be bought and sold like cattle. Genevieve felt Lucian stiffen beside her, felt the fury radiating from him in waves. But before he could respond, she placed her hand on his arm and stepped forward. "Lady Ashby." Her voice was clear, calm, and carried across the silent ballroom with perfect precision. "I couldn't help but overhear your concern for my welfare. How touching that you've taken such an interest in my family's financial difficulties, though I'm surprised you have time for such charitable thoughts, given your own family's recent troubles." Lady Ashby's face went pale. The rumors about her son's syphilis had never been confirmed publicly, but everyone knew. Everyone always knew. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "Of course not." Genevieve smiled, and it was a blade wrapped in silk. "Just as I'm sure you don't mean to suggest that a 12-year-old girl was somehow responsible for a contract signed by her father without her knowledge or consent. Just as I'm sure you don't mean to imply that the victim of a crime is somehow complicit in her own victimization, because that would be not only cruel, but profoundly stupid. And I have always credited you with at least a basic intelligence, Lady Ashby, even if the evidence has sometimes been lacking." A gasp rippled through the crowd. No one spoke to Lady Ashby like that. No one challenged the grand dames of society and survived. But Genevieve wasn't finished. "Let me be clear," she continued, raising her voice so that every person in the ballroom could hear. My father sold me to a monster when I was 12 years old. That contract was signed without my knowledge, without my consent, and against every principle of decency and law. Lord Edmund Grimsworth murdered 2 women before me, and he intended to murder me too. Slowly, painfully, in ways I will not describe in polite company. The only reason I am standing here today is because someone cared enough to save me. Someone who broke the law, yes, who committed acts that society would condemn, but who did so because the law itself was unjust, because the system that was supposed to protect innocent girls instead enabled predators like Grimsworth to purchase them like livestock. She turned slowly, meeting eyes throughout the room. The women who had whispered about her, the men who had assessed her like merchandise, the society that had decided her scars made her worthless. I am not ashamed of my scars. I am not ashamed of my history. I am not ashamed of the man who saved me or the fire that marked me. Every one of these burns is a testament to my survival, proof that I am stronger than the forces that tried to destroy me. And if any of you have a problem with that, if my presence in your precious ballrooms offends your delicate sensibilities, then I suggest you examine your own consciences. Because every one of you knew what Grimsworth was. Every one of you heard the rumors about his dead wives. And not one of you, not a single one, did anything to stop him. The silence that followed was absolute. And then, from somewhere near the back of the room, someone began to clap. It was Lady Pemberton, the Duchess who had hosted the ball where Genevieve first saw Grimsworth again. She walked forward through the parting crowd, her face set with determination, and took Genevieve's hand. "Well said, Miss Hartwell. Well said indeed." She turned to face the assembled guests. "I have been a coward for too long. We all have. We knew what Grimsworth was, and we said nothing because it was easier to look away. But this young woman, this brave, magnificent young woman, has shown us all what real courage looks like. I, for one, am honored to stand beside her." More applause joined hers. Lord Blackwell stepped forward, then Lady Whitmore, then a dozen others, the tide of opinion shifting visibly, publicly, undeniably. The same society that had whispered about Genevieve for 11 years was now celebrating her as a heroine. And through it all, Lucian watched her with an expression of such fierce pride, such overwhelming love, that Genevieve felt tears prick at her eyes. Later, when they had retreated to a quiet corner of the garden, he pulled her into his arms and held her as if he would never let go. "You were magnificent," he murmured against her hair. "I was terrified. That's what made it magnificent." He pulled back to look at her face, and his eyes were suspiciously bright. "Do you know, I think that was the first time I've ever seen you truly happy in a ballroom. It was the first time I wasn't hiding." She reached up to touch his cheek, marveling at the softness of his expression, so different from the cold, controlled Duke the rest of the world saw. "You made me brave enough to stop hiding, Lucian. You, and your impossible, obsessive, all-consuming love. It's yours," he said. "All of it. Forever." But their moment of peace was not to last, because somewhere across the city, Grimsworth was reading about his social destruction in the morning papers, and he was preparing his revenge. And finally, when Grimsworth was isolated and desperate, came the legal reckoning. Lucian had found witnesses, a former housekeeper willing to testify about the beatings, a physician willing to confirm the poisoning, a solicitor willing to produce the contract that proved Grimsworth had purchased young girls from desperate families, had viewed them as property to be used and discarded. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and absolutely damning. But Grimsworth wasn't finished. Not yet. The night before his arrest warrant was to be issued, he came to Aldridge House. Genevieve was alone when he arrived. Lucian had been called away to a meeting with the magistrate, and most of the servants had been dismissed for the evening. Only Mrs. Blackwood, the elderly housekeeper, remained, dozing in her sitting room on the ground floor. Genevieve was in the library, reading by candlelight, when she heard the crash. It came from the rear of the house, the sound of glass shattering, followed by footsteps. Multiple footsteps. Not just one person, but several. She was on her feet in an instant, her heart pounding. The library had two exits, the main door, which led to the central hallway, and a smaller servant's entrance that connected to the back stairs. She moved toward the servant's door, but before she could reach it, the main door burst open. Grimsworth stood in the doorway, flanked by two large men she didn't recognize. His skeletal face was twisted with rage, his dead eyes blazing with something that might have been madness. "Did you think I would simply accept defeat?" His voice was barely controlled, shaking with fury. "Did you think I would let that arrogant Duke destroy everything I've worked for without consequence? The authorities are coming for you." Genevieve kept her voice steady, though her hands were trembling. "Whatever you do to me tonight, it won't change what's waiting for you tomorrow. Tomorrow is irrelevant." Grimsworth stepped into the library, and the two men fanned out behind him, blocking both exits. What matters is tonight. What matters is taking from Aldridge the only thing he truly cares about. "He'll kill you for this. He'll try." Grimsworth smiled, and it was the worst thing she had ever seen. Worse than the fire, worse than the scars, worse than anything she had endured in 11 years of survival. "But by the time he finds us, it will be too late. You and I have unfinished business, Miss Hartwell, a contract to fulfill, a wedding night that was promised to me 15 years ago." One of the men grabbed her arm, and Genevieve's training took over. Lucian had insisted she learn to defend herself, had brought in instructors to teach her how to fight, how to escape, how to turn a woman's perceived weakness into unexpected strength. She had thought it paranoid at the time. Now she understood it as one more expression of his obsessive protection. She twisted, using the man's momentum against him, and drove her elbow into his throat. He staggered back, choking, and she ran. Not toward the doors, they were blocked, but toward the window. The library was on the ground floor. If she could break through the glass, get into the garden, she might be able to reach the street. Find help. Find anyone. Hands closed around her waist from behind, lifting her off her feet. The second man, bigger than the first, stronger, his arms like iron bands around her midsection. "Scream if you like," Grimsworth said, approaching with leisurely steps. "There's no one to hear. I made sure the servants were occupied." Mrs. Blackwood. Terror seized her heart. "What did you do to her?" "Nothing permanent. A little chloroform. She'll wake with a headache in a few hours, assuming you cooperate." He reached out, tracing a finger down her scarred cheek, and Genevieve felt her skin crawl. "Such a pity about the burns. You would have been truly beautiful without them. But I suppose I'll learn to appreciate them. Scars can be interesting. You're insane." "No, I'm persistent." His hand moved to her throat, not squeezing, just resting there, a reminder of his power, his control. "Your father promised you to me. Aldridge stole you, and now, after 15 years of patience, I'm simply reclaiming what's mine. I was never yours. You were always mine." His fingers tightened, just slightly. "From the moment your father signed that contract, you belonged to me. Every breath you've taken since then has been borrowed. Every year you've spent in Aldridge's house has been time stolen from our marriage. But tonight, that debt comes due." He nodded to the man holding her, and they began to drag her toward the door. Genevieve fought. She kicked and twisted and screamed, knowing it was probably useless, but unable to surrender without a struggle. She thought of Lucian, of his face when he looked at her, of his voice when he said he loved her, of the life they might have had if Grimsworth had never returned. She thought of his sister Eliza, who had faced this same monster and lost. She thought of the fire that had forged her into someone stronger than she had ever known. She would not go quietly. Whatever happened tonight, she would make Grimsworth work for every moment of it. They were almost to the front door when a voice cut through the chaos, low, deadly, and thrumming with a violence that seemed to shake the very walls. Release her. Now. Lucian stood at the top of the stairs, and he was carrying a pistol aimed directly at Grimsworth's head. But it wasn't the weapon that made the three intruders freeze. It was his face. Gone was the controlled Duke, the careful guardian, the man who measured every word and action. In his place stood something older, something darker, something that looked ready to wade through blood and fire to reach the woman he loved. Aldridge. Grimsworth's composure cracked for the first time. How? You were supposed to be. You think I would leave her unprotected? You think I don't have people watching this house every moment of every day? Lucian descended the stairs slowly, the pistol never wavering. I received word of your arrival before you reached the front gate. The most only reason you made it this far is because I wanted to catch you in the act, to ensure that when the magistrates arrive, there can be no question of your guilt. The magistrates? They're on their way, along with half the constables in London. Lucian reached the bottom of the stairs and began to advance. Breaking and entering, assault, attempted abduction. Added to the murder charges already waiting for you, you'll hang 3 times over. Grimsworth's face twisted with fury, and then, suddenly, he lunged. Not toward Lucian, toward Genevieve. His hand closed around her arm, dragging her in front of him like a shield, producing a knife from somewhere in his coat and pressing it against her throat. Put down the gun, he hissed, or I'll open her throat right here. Lucian stopped. His face went absolutely blank, the dangerous stillness of a predator calculating its strike. If you harm her, he said, his voice almost conversational, I will not kill you. Killing would be too quick, too merciful. Instead, I will ensure that you spend the rest of your miserable life in agony. I will have you castrated. I will have your tongue cut out. I will have you locked in the darkest cell in Newgate, surrounded by men who know exactly what you've done to women and children, and I will pay them to make every day of your existence a lesson in suffering. Do you understand me, Grimsworth? Do you understand that there is no escape from this room that doesn't end in your complete and utter destruction? The knife trembled against Genevieve's throat. She could feel Grimsworth's terror, the sudden, devastating realization that he had miscalculated, that he had underestimated the depth of Lucian's obsession. You're bluffing. I burned down a house full of people to save her. Lucian's voice was soft, almost gentle. I murdered her entire family because the alternative was letting her fall into your hands. Do you really think there's anything I wouldn't do? Any line I wouldn't cross? Any sin I wouldn't embrace if it meant keeping her safe? In the silence that followed, Genevieve heard the clatter of hooves in the street outside, the shouts of men approaching, the unmistakable sounds of rescue arriving too late and exactly on time. And she made her choice. She let her body go limp, dead weight in Grimsworth's arms, and as he struggled to hold her up, she grabbed the hand holding the knife and bit down with all the strength she had. Grimsworth screamed. The knife clattered to the floor, and Genevieve threw herself sideways, out of his reach, giving Lucian a clear shot. He didn't take it. Instead, he crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, grabbed Grimsworth by the throat, and slammed him against the wall with enough force to crack the plaster. "You touched her." Each word was punctuated by another slam. "You threatened her. You put a knife to her throat." Slam, slam, slam. "You dared to think you could take her from me." "Lucian." Genevieve's voice cut through his rage. "Lucian, stop! The magistrates are here. Let them take him." For a moment, she thought he wouldn't listen. His hand tightened around Grimsworth's throat, and she saw the temptation in his eyes, the desire to end this here and now, to ensure that this monster could never threaten her again. But then he looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. The madness receded, replaced by something calmer, steadier, more controlled. "You're right." He released Grimsworth, letting him crumple to the floor. "Death is too quick for him. I want him to suffer." The constables burst through the door moments later, and Grimsworth was dragged away in chains, screaming threats and promises that no one bothered to acknowledge. The 2 hired men were arrested as well, and Mrs. Blackwood was found unconscious but unharmed in her sitting room. And Lucian held Genevieve in his arms until she stopped shaking, whispering promises against her hair, promises of protection, of vengeance, of a love so consuming that nothing and no one would ever threaten her again. "Marry me," he said, when the authorities had finally left, and they were alone in the ruined library. "That's not how proposals work." "I don't care how proposals work. I care about never spending another night without you. I care about falling asleep with you in my arms and waking up to your face every morning. I care about making you mine in every way the law allows, so that no one, not Grimsworth, not society, not God himself, can ever try to take you from me again." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears. She hadn't realized she was crying. "Marry me, Genevieve, not because of guilt or obligation, because I am desperately, obsessively, irrevocably in love with you, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it." "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you. But first we need to deal with the unconscious man, bleeding on our floor, and the watch at the door, and probably a great deal of explaining." Lucian laughed, a real laugh, bright and startled and utterly joyful. "I suppose that would be prudent." "I'm always prudent." "You just hit a man with a fire poker." "Prudently." He kissed her again, softer this time, a promise of things to come. "I love you, Genevieve Hartwell. I have loved you for years, and I will love you until my last breath. And if there is anything after death, I will love you then too." "I love you too," she said. "Now let's go ruin Grimsworth's life." The trial was the scandal of the decade. Every newspaper in London covered it. Every drawing room buzzed with discussion. Every person who had ever crossed paths with Lord Edmund Grimsworth suddenly remembered warning signs they had been too polite to mention. The prosecution presented its case with devastating precision. Witnesses who had remained silent for years finally found the courage to speak. The first, wife's sister, who had seen the bruises hidden beneath silk sleeves. The physician who had been paid to attribute death to illness when he knew perfectly well it was poison. The housekeeper who had fled in the night after witnessing something too terrible to describe in polite company. The investigator who had traced Grimsworth's movements across Europe, revealing a pattern of purchased brides and convenient deaths that stretched back decades. And then there was Genevieve. She took the stand on the 3rd day of the trial, and the courtroom fell absolutely silent. Every eye followed her as she walked to the witness box. This woman with her visible scars, her lifted chin, her refusal to hide what Grimsworth's kind had tried to make shameful. "Miss Hartwell," the prosecutor began, "can you describe for the court the events of the night Lord Grimsworth broke into your home?" She could. She did. In clear, unflinching detail, she recounted every moment: the crash of breaking glass, the terror of capture, the knife against her throat, the rescue that came only because the man she loved had anticipated Grimsworth's desperation. But it was her final statement that made the papers, that was reprinted across the country, that changed the way people talked about girls who had been sold and women who had survived. Lord Grimsworth believed he owned me because a piece of paper said he did. He believed that my father's debt made me his property. He believed that my silence, my fear, my scars made me less than human, made me something to be used and discarded at his pleasure. He was wrong. I am not property. I am not merchandise. I am not a debt to be collected. I am a woman who survived fire and betrayal, and the worst that men like Grimsworth can inflict, and I am still standing. I will always be standing. Long after Grimsworth is dust and memory, the world will remember that a scarred girl stood in this courtroom and refused to be silent. The gallery erupted in applause. The judge had to call for order 3 times before quiet was restored, and when Genevieve returned to her seat, Lucian took her hand and held it so tightly she thought her bones might crack. But she didn't pull away. She never wanted to pull away. The jury deliberated for 47 minutes. The verdict was unanimous on all counts: guilty of murder in the deaths of his 2 wives, guilty of attempted abduction, guilty of assault, guilty of conspiracy to commit fraud, guilty of crimes against nature and decency, a charge that made even hardened journalists avert their eyes. Lord Edmund Grimsworth was sentenced to hang. Genevieve was not in the courtroom when the verdict was read. She had given her testimony earlier and saw no reason to watch a monster's final humiliation. But Lucian was there, and he told her later how Grimsworth's face had looked when the judge pronounced the sentence, how the arrogance had finally cracked, how the monster had finally understood that there was no escape. "Did you feel satisfied?" she asked him that night, as they sat together in the library that had witnessed so many of their debates and discoveries. Lucian considered the question. "No. Satisfaction implies that justice has been served, that the scales have been balanced. But there is no balance possible for what he did. Eliza is still dead. His other victims are still dead. No amount of punishment can undo that suffering." "Then what do you feel?" "Relief." He took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Relief that he can never hurt anyone again. Relief that you're safe. And gratitude. Overwhelming gratitude. That you're here with me despite everything." "Always," she said. "Despite everything, and because of everything. Always." The execution took place 3 weeks later, on a gray morning that seemed to match the occasion. Neither Lucian nor Genevieve attended, though they received word within hours that justice had been served. Grimsworth had gone to the gallows cursing Aldridge's name, promising revenge from beyond the grave. But the dead make empty promises, and the living had a future to build. The wedding took place 3 weeks after that in the small chapel at Aldridge Park. It was not the grand society wedding that the Duke of Aldridge's marriage would typically command. There were no 500 guests, no elaborate decorations, no endless parade of courses at the wedding breakfast. Instead, there were only the people who truly mattered, a handful of trusted friends, the servants who had become family over 11 years, and the vicar who had known Lucian since childhood. Genevieve wore a gown of ivory silk that left her scars visible because she was done hiding, done being ashamed of marks that had tried to destroy her and failed. The seamstress had asked, delicately, if she might prefer sleeves that covered more, a neckline that concealed the burns at her throat. Genevieve had looked at her sketches for a long moment, then said, "My husband has seen every scar on my body. He's traced them with his fingers, kissed them with his lips, told me they're beautiful because they're part of me. I will not hide them on our wedding day." The gown flowed around her like water, the ivory silk catching the candlelight and transforming her into something ethereal, a creature of fire and survival, walking toward a future she had never dared to imagine. Lucian waited for her at the altar with an expression of such naked adoration that several of the guests had to look away, overwhelmed by the intensity of it. He had chosen to wear dark gray rather than the traditional black, and when Genevieve asked him why, he had said, "Black is for mourning, and today I have nothing to mourn. Today I have everything." When the vicar asked if any present knew of any reason why these two should not be married, a silence fell over the chapel, a silence heavy with history, with fire and murder and impossible choices, with guilt and forgiveness and love that had survived the unsurvivable. No one spoke. "Lucian Edmund Ashworth," the vicar continued, "wilt thou have this woman to thy wedded wife, to live together after God's ordinance in the holy estate of matrimony? Wilt thou love her, comfort her, honor, and keep her in sickness and in health, and, forsaking all other, keep thee only unto her, so long as ye both shall live?" "I will." Lucian's voice was steady, absolute, a vow not just to the church, but to every power in the universe. "I will love her beyond the end of time. I will protect her against any threat. I will spend every day of my existence making her glad she chose me. This I swear, on my honor, my soul, and everything I hold sacred." And when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Lucian kissed Genevieve with a tenderness that made her heart ache, and she kissed him back with a passion that made several of the older guests blush. The wedding night was everything and nothing like what Genevieve had expected. Lucian was careful with her at first, so careful that she finally had to pull him down onto the bed and inform him that she was not made of glass, that she had survived fire and grief and the revelation of devastating secrets, and that she could certainly survive being loved by her husband. "I don't deserve you," he murmured against her throat, his hands trembling as they traced the scars that mapped her survival. "You keep saying that. Because it keeps being true. Then spend the rest of your life earning me." She pulled his face up to meet her eyes, letting him see the desire that burned beneath her composure. "That's all any of us can do, Lucian. Try to be worthy of the love we're given, even when we know we'll fall short. You're not a good man. You've done terrible things, and I'll never pretend otherwise. But you're my man, and I choose you anyway." Lucian's eyes burned with something that might have been tears, might have been joy, might have been a combination too complex to name. "I will spend every moment making you glad of that choice. See that you do." And he did. He worshipped her that night, slowly, thoroughly, with a devotion that bordered on religious. He traced every scar with his lips, murmuring praise against her skin, telling her she was beautiful and strong and brave and his, always his, forever his. When she finally fell asleep in his arms, exhausted and sated and more at peace than she had ever been, Lucian stayed awake for hours, watching her face in the moonlight. "I love you," he whispered into the darkness. "I have loved you through guilt and grief and 11 years of silence. I will love you through whatever comes next." The years that followed were not easy. No marriage built on such foundations could be easy. There were nights when Genevieve woke screaming from nightmares about fire, and Lucian held her until the shaking stopped. There were days when guilt overwhelmed him, and she had to remind him that penance was not the same as living, that he owed it to the people he had wronged to build something good from the ashes of his sins. But there was also joy. So much joy. The morning Genevieve told Lucian she was with child, He had gone absolutely still, then dropped to his knees right there in the breakfast room and pressed his face against her stomach, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I never thought, his voice broke. I never imagined I could have this. A family, children, a future that isn't just paying for the past. You have it, she said, running her fingers through his hair. You have me, and you have this child, and you have whatever life we build together. The past doesn't own us anymore, Lucian. We own ourselves. They built many good things. Schools for girls who had nowhere else to go. Shelters for women fleeing abusive situations. Legal funds that helped victims of crimes like Grimsworth's find justice in a system that often failed them. The Aldridge name became synonymous with reform, with protection, with the fierce determination to ensure that no one else suffered what they had suffered. Genevieve testified before Parliament 3 times, advocating for changes to the laws that had allowed men like her father to sell their daughters like property. She spoke about coverture, about the legal death that marriage meant for women, about the desperate need for reforms that would protect the vulnerable from the powerful. Her scars, once whispered about in ballrooms, became a symbol of survival, proof that it was possible to walk through fire and emerge stronger on the other side. And 5 years after their wedding, when Genevieve placed a newborn daughter in Lucian's arms, she watched his face transform with a love so pure, so overwhelming, that it erased, just for a moment, all the shadows of the past. "What shall we name her?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Genevieve smiled. "I was thinking, Eliza, after the sister you loved." Lucian's composure shattered completely. He wept, holding their daughter close, and Genevieve wrapped her arms around them both, her family, imperfect and complicated, and built on impossible choices, but hers nonetheless. "Thank you," he whispered, "for forgiving me, for loving me, for giving me this." "I told you," Genevieve said softly. "You're mine. You have been since the fire. You will be until we die. And if there's anything after that, I'll find you there too," he finished. "I'll always find you, Genevieve, in this life and every other." 2 more children followed, a son they named Edmund, after no one in particular, just because they liked the sound of it, and another daughter they called Rose, for the flowers that bloomed in the garden where Lucian had first realized he loved his ward as more than a ward. The children grew up knowing their parents' story. Not all of it, not the darkest parts, but enough to understand that love could be complicated, that forgiveness was not weakness, that people could be both heroes and villains depending on the angle of the light. They grew up surrounded by love so fierce it sometimes frightened their nursemaids, watched over by a father whose possessiveness had mellowed into something warmer, but no less intense. On Lucian's 60th birthday, Genevieve found him standing in the room where he had once kept his drawings of her. The room was different now, a nursery, then a playroom, now simply a sitting room where the family gathered on rainy afternoons. But she had seen him pause sometimes at the door, looking at the space where his obsession had been catalogued in charcoal and ink. "Any regrets?" she asked, slipping her hand into his. He considered the question for a long moment. "I regret the fire. I will always regret the fire. I regret the lives lost, the innocence destroyed, the years of lies between us." He turned to face her, and his eyes, still that extraordinary smoke gray, still capable of looking at her like she was the only person in the world, were bright with emotion. "But I cannot regret you. I cannot regret this life we've built, these children we've raised, this love that has been both my salvation and my damnation. If I had to do it all again, knowing exactly how it would unfold, I would make the same choices. Because they led me here. To you. To us. Murderer, she said softly. It was a pet name now, spoken with fondness rather than accusation. Always, he agreed, but only for you. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, soft and white, covering the world in gentle silence. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light across a family that should not have existed, that had been forged in destruction and tempered in impossible love. Genevieve leaned her head against Lucian's shoulder and watched the flames dance. Some people are saved by the person who destroys them. Some people choose to love the unforgivable, and sometimes that choice creates something more beautiful than either of them could have built alone. Dear listener, as you step away from this story, I want you to think about something. What would you sacrifice to protect someone you loved? What lines would you cross? What sins would you bear on your soul if it meant keeping them safe? There are no easy answers to these questions. That's what makes them worth asking. If Genevieve and Lucian's story stayed with you, if you felt the weight of their impossible choices and the brightness of their hard-won joy, please hit subscribe and click the bell so you don't miss the next tale. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and which moment affected you most. Share this story with someone who understands that love is rarely simple and forgiveness is never easy. We're so close to 1,000 subscribers, and every single one of you brings us closer to that goal. You're not just listeners. You're the reason these stories exist. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring about characters who refuse to be simply good or simply evil. Until next time, this has been The Duke's Revenge. Take care of yourselves. Hold on to the people you love. And remember that even in the darkest moments, redemption is possible if you're brave enough to reach for it.